It was a bright, sunny morning in the bustling city of Nakuru, and the streets were already filled with people hustling to and fro. But deep inside the tall, glass-walled building of one of the city's largest corporations, the air was thick with tension. A young woman named Emma, who worked as a cleaner in the building, was in the middle of wiping down the gleaming floors when she heard a conversation between two well-dressed men. She tried to focus on her work, but her ears caught their words. "Did you hear the news?" one of them asked. "The CEO's mother is in town today. She's arriving this afternoon." The other man nodded. "Yes, she's supposed to meet with him, but he hasn't been very clear about why she's coming. I think it's something important." Emma's curiosity piqued. The CEO of the company, Daniel Thompson, was a well-known man in Nakuru. He was rich, powerful, and always on the news. Emma didn't know much about him, but she had heard stories of how kind he was to his employees. Everyone in the building spoke highly of him. What the two men didn't know was that Emma had been cleaning the CEO's office for the past few weeks, and she had caught glimpses of him in his office. She had even seen his picture hanging on the wall, next to his mother. He looked nothing like his mother, who was much older and had a kind, wrinkled face full of wisdom. Emma didn't know much about the woman, but she always wondered what she was like. Later that afternoon, the moment arrived. Emma was just finishing up the last corner of the building when she saw an old woman walking down the hallway toward her. The woman was frail, dressed in simple clothes, and had a cane in her hand. She moved slowly but with purpose, her steps echoing in the otherwise quiet hallway. Without thinking, Emma rushed over to the woman. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked kindly. The old woman smiled warmly. "I'm looking for my son, Daniel Thompson. I haven't seen him in years." Emma's heart skipped a beat. The woman was the CEO's mother. She hadn't realized it, but now she could see the resemblance in the woman's gentle smile, the way she carried herself. "Oh, ma'am, I think Mr. Thompson's office is just around the corner. He should be there." The old woman nodded and slowly made her way down the hallway with Emma by her side, guiding her carefully. But just as they reached the door of the CEO's office, a loud crash sounded from inside. Emma turned in shock, and the old woman stumbled. The door to the office flung open, and in that moment, they saw something that would change their lives forever. Inside the office, Daniel Thompson was lying on the floor, unconscious. His chair had fallen over, and the phone was hanging off the hook. A strange smell filled the air. Emma's heart raced. She turned to the old woman, who now looked pale. "Don't worry," Emma said quickly. "I'll get help." But just as Emma turned to leave, the woman stopped her, her eyes filled with fear. "No, don't leave me," she whispered. "I need to tell you something. I need you to know who I really am." Emma stared at her, confusion swirling in her mind. "What do you mean, ma'am?" The old woman slowly bent down and whispered in Emma's ear. "I am the mother of Daniel Thompson, the CEO. And I have been watching you. You have no idea how much your kindness means to me. But now things are going to change, and I need you to be strong." Just as the words left her lips, the lights flickered and went out. The whole building seemed to shake, and a loud, spine-chilling noise echoed through the halls. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. What was happening? And why did the old woman seem so scared? Before she could ask another question, the lights flickered back on. The door to the CEO's office slammed shut, and everything went still. Emma turned to the old woman, but she was gone. Vanished. Emma was left standing in the hallway, her mind spinning. What had just happened? Who was this woman? What was her connection to the CEO? And why had she disappeared so suddenly? As she stood there, trying to process the events, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone else. But when she saw who it was, her heart nearly stopped. It was Daniel Thompson himself, standing there, looking as if he had just woken up from a deep sleep. "Emma," he said slowly, his voice quiet, "you need to come with me. It's time to talk." And that was when the full weight of the situation hit her. Everything she thought she knew had just turned upside down. Story leading up to the shocking event. Several days before that strange moment, Emma had been struggling. Life wasn't easy for her. She lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Nakuru, and every day was a challenge. Her job as a cleaner at the large corporate building was her only source of income, and it didn't pay much. She barely made enough to cover rent and buy food, but she never complained. Emma was a hard worker. She would wake up at 5 a.m. every day, clean her apartment, and then catch the early bus to work. Despite her difficult life, she always remained hopeful. She believed that if she worked hard and helped others, one day her good deeds would be rewarded. She didn't expect anything in return. She simply loved helping people. She often gave up her lunch to homeless people she passed on the street, and she always stopped to help anyone in need. She had always believed in the power of kindness, even if it meant giving away what little she had. One day, Emma was cleaning the hallway of the building when she noticed a small old lady sitting on a bench. The woman looked tired, and her clothes were worn, but there was something about her that seemed so wise. Emma approached the woman with her usual warm smile. "Ma'am, would you like me to help you with anything?" she asked kindly. The woman looked up at Emma and smiled faintly. "Oh, no thank you, dear. I'm just resting. I've been traveling for a long time." Emma nodded, but she didn't leave. She sat next to the old woman and began to chat with her. They spoke about everything: life, love, and dreams. Emma didn't know much about the woman's past, but the old lady's stories touched her heart deeply. Emma couldn't help but feel a strong connection to her. Something about the way the old woman spoke made Emma believe that she had lived through many hardships herself. After their conversation, Emma continued her cleaning duties. She didn't think much of the old woman's visit at first, but later, when she saw the picture of Daniel Thompson on the wall and realized the woman she had helped was his mother, her world turned upside down. The next few days, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. She had always been a believer in fate, and now it seemed like fate had brought her face to face with someone important. Little did she know that her simple act of kindness would soon lead her into a world of power, secrets, and danger. Emma's mind raced as she stood there, staring at Daniel Thompson, the CEO. His face was pale, his eyes wide and full of confusion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if time itself had frozen. She had just witnessed something so strange and surreal, and now she found herself in front of the man whose life was suddenly intertwined with hers. "Emma," Daniel spoke again, his voice low and serious. "You need to come with me. It's time to talk." She nodded, her legs feeling shaky as she followed him down the hallway. He led her through the familiar corridors of the building, past the quiet offices, and into a small, private meeting room. The door shut behind them with a soft click, and Emma took a seat, her hands trembling in her lap. Daniel sat across from her, studying her with intense eyes. "I know this is all a lot to take in. You must be wondering what just happened back there. Why my mother disappeared, and why you were brought into all of this." Emma swallowed hard. "Yes, I am. What's going on? What did your mother mean when she said she had been watching me? And why did she leave so suddenly?" Daniel sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "It's a long story, Emma, and I don't even know where to begin. But I'll start with the truth." Emma's heart pounded. She had no idea what to expect next. Was this going to be a story of betrayal, of hidden secrets, or perhaps a family feud that was about to unravel? "My mother," Daniel began slowly, "is not just any old woman. She was once one of the most powerful figures in this city, long before I became the CEO of this company. But she had to leave that life behind when something tragic happened to our family. After that, she went into hiding. Only a few people knew where she was, and even fewer knew why she had vanished." Emma's confusion deepened. "But why are you telling me all of this? What does it have to do with me?" Daniel leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You see, Emma, my mother is a woman of incredible influence, and she has been watching you for a reason. She saw something in you that I never noticed before. Your kindness, your ability to see the good in people, even when life is unfair to you." Emma blinked, unsure of what to make of his words. "I'm just a cleaner," she said quietly. "Why would your mother be watching me?" Daniel's expression softened. "Because, Emma, you have the power to change everything. You may not know it yet, but you are a key part of something much bigger than yourself. My mother knew this from the moment she met you." Emma's mind was spinning. What was he talking about? She was just an ordinary woman, working hard to make ends meet. How could she possibly be part of something big? "Why do you think she came back today?" Daniel asked. She knew something was going to happen. Something important. Emma looked down at her hands, struggling to process the flood of information. She had always believed that if she did good, it would come back to her in some way. But this? This was beyond her understanding. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door, making both of them jump. The door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped inside. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing eyes. He looked like someone who had no time for nonsense. "Daniel," the man said curtly, "we have a problem. It's about your mother." Daniel stood up quickly, his face hardening. "What now?" The man's eyes flicked to Emma. I'm afraid we have some urgent business to attend to. Can we speak privately? Daniel's gaze shifted between Emma and the man. He hesitated, then turned to Emma. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Emma nodded, though she had no intention of leaving. She needed answers, and she wasn't about to walk away without them. As Daniel and the man exited the room, Emma was left alone, her thoughts racing. What was going on? Why was this man so urgent about her mother? Was this connected to the strange events that had been unfolding? The more she thought about it, the more questions piled up in her mind. Who was really in control here? As she sat there waiting, a feeling of dread began to settle in her chest. She knew something big was coming, and somehow she was right in the middle of it. The tension in the room grew thick as Emma continued to sit in silence. It felt as though hours had passed, but in reality, only a few minutes had gone by. She looked at the clock on the wall, counting the seconds, but her mind kept returning to the same thoughts. Who was this man who had just entered the room? What did he know about her mother? Why had Daniel's demeanor changed so suddenly when he saw him? She shook her head, trying to push the questions aside for the moment. She would get answers, she had to. But before she could organize her thoughts, the door to the room opened again, and Daniel walked back in, looking even more serious than before. We have a problem, he said quietly, closing the door behind him. There's something going on that neither of us expected. Emma stood up, her heart racing. What do you mean? What happened? Daniel took a deep breath before speaking. My mother, she's been in danger for a long time. The reason she disappeared all those years ago was because of someone she trusted. Someone very close to us. He paused, glancing at Emma, before continuing. And now they're back. And they want her gone. Permanently. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Who? Who is it? Daniel's eyes were filled with pain as he met her gaze. The person who is behind all of this is someone I never thought I would have to face. It's my own brother. Emma's mouth went dry. Your brother? But you never mentioned him before. Daniel nodded. He's been living in the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. He's been plotting against our family for a long time, and now he's made his move. The weight of his words hit Emma like a brick. She had no idea how deep this web of family secrets went, but now it was clear. Everything had changed. But just as she opened her mouth to ask another question, the lights suddenly flickered again, followed by a loud crash from somewhere in the building. Emma's heart stopped. Daniel stood up quickly, panic in his eyes. We need to go. Now. Before Emma could respond, he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. The world outside had just become a much more dangerous place. The moment they stepped out of the meeting room, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The sharp crack of glass followed by distant shouts echoed down the hallway. Daniel's grip on Emma's arm tightened, and she could feel his heart pounding against her as he led her swiftly through the building. What's happening? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes darting around, every sound seeming to make him more alert. He moved quickly, almost as if he were expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. We need to get to the safe room, he said finally, his voice strained. It's the only place where we'll be safe. The safe room was a place in the building that most employees didn't even know existed. It was hidden behind thick, reinforced doors, designed to protect the most valuable individuals in the company in case of an emergency. Daniel had never thought he would actually need to use it. But now, with his brother threatening everything, it seemed like the only option. As they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with another man in a suit, this one holding a gun. He was standing near an elevator, his eyes cold and calculating as he watched Daniel approach. Emma froze, panic crawling up her spine. Who are you? Emma asked, her voice shaking. Daniel didn't flinch. Just stay behind me, he whispered. The man in the suit didn't move. He didn't even seem surprised that Daniel was approaching with Emma in tow. His lips curled into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. Mr. Thompson, you've been expecting me, haven't you? The man said, his voice low and mocking. Your brother sent me to deliver a message. Daniel's face tightened with anger. I don't want your message. I want my mother back. The man shook his head, a sadistic glint in his eyes. That's the thing, Mr. Thompson. You won't be getting her back. Not unless you do exactly what I say. Emma's heart was hammering in her chest. What does he want? She asked, glancing between the man and Daniel. Daniel's jaw clenched. He wants control. Of everything. The company, the family, my mother. and he's not going to stop until he gets it. The man in the suit took a step forward, making Emma feel as though the walls were closing in. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and it made her stomach churn with dread. "You have a choice, Mr. Thompson," the man continued, his voice dripping with venom. "You can either hand over control of your company and your mother, or I'll take everything. Your choice." Daniel's eyes blazed with fury. "You don't understand. I'll never let you hurt my mother. She's everything to me." The man shrugged as if Daniel's words meant nothing. "Then you'll watch as she suffers." Before Emma could react, Daniel moved swiftly, his hand reaching for the gun the man was holding. In one fluid motion, he knocked it out of the man's grasp, sending it clattering to the floor. The two men grappled, but it was clear that Daniel had the upper hand. He had been trained for situations like this. In the chaos, Emma saw her chance. She darted past the two men, her feet barely touching the floor as she ran for the elevator. She had to get to the safe room, whatever it took. Just as she reached the elevator doors, she heard the crash of metal and the sound of a body hitting the floor. She didn't dare look back. The doors slid open just as Daniel's voice called out to her. "Emma, no. Get to the stairs." But it was too late. The elevator doors closed, and she was swept away to an unknown fate. The elevator hummed as it descended. Emma's pulse raced in her ears. The lights flickered once again, and she could feel the tension building inside her chest. She had no idea where the elevator was taking her. Her instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't stop herself now. She had to see this through. She had to find the safe room. The elevator slowed to a stop with a jarring lurch, and the doors slid open to reveal a dimly lit hallway. It was eerily quiet, unlike the rest of the building. There was no sound of employees working, no phones ringing, just the soft hum of the building's machinery in the background. Emma stepped out hesitantly, glancing around. The walls were lined with old photographs, dusty and forgotten, as if the hallway hadn't been used in years. She walked cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she moved deeper into the corridor, she noticed something strange. A door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she moved closer. The door creaked open with a push, revealing a small room filled with computers, monitors, and stacks of paperwork. But it wasn't the technology that caught her attention. It was the man standing in the center of the room. This man wasn't like the others. He wasn't in a suit, and he didn't seem to belong in the corporate world at all. His clothes were dark, his face obscured by a hood. But it was the coldness in his eyes that made Emma freeze in her tracks. This man was different. This man was dangerous. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Emma's stomach twisted with fear. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. The man stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm the one who controls everything that happens in this building. Everything that happens to your boss, to Daniel, and to you." Before Emma could react, the man reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the center of the room. She struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. "Don't worry," he said with a sick smile. "You're just a pawn in a much bigger game, and you've been chosen for a reason." Emma's heart raced as she fought to break free. But the man's grip tightened, and with a sudden twist, she was forced into a chair. The lights above flickered again, and Emma's world spun. Was this the end of everything? Had she just walked into a trap that was too big for her to escape? Just as the man was about to speak again, there was a loud bang from behind them. The door to the room flew open, and Daniel rushed in, his eyes blazing with fury. "Let her go," he shouted. The man turned, his cold smile widening. "So, you've come to play, have you? Well, it's too late for that, Mr. Thompson." Emma felt the adrenaline surge through her body as Daniel stepped forward, his fists clenched. He was ready for anything, and Emma knew that this battle was just beginning. The room seemed to close in on Emma as she watched Daniel face off with the mysterious man. The air was heavy with tension, the only sounds being the faint hum of the building's electrical systems and the quick, shallow breaths of everyone in the room. Emma's hands trembled as she tried to move, but the man's grip on her was like iron, keeping her firmly in place. "You're wasting your time, Daniel," the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You can't stop what's already in motion. Your mother is gone, your company is mine, and there's nothing you can do about it." Daniel's eyes flashed with fury, but his expression remained calm. "I'm not going to let you win. Not now, not ever." The man in the hood laughed, the sound hollow and menacing. "You think you can stop me? Your mother's been hiding in the shadows for too long. She's no match for what's coming next. Emma's heart raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Who was this man? Why was he so bent on destroying Daniel's family? And why did it feel like everything she had known had just been flipped upside down? Let her go. Daniel's voice was sharp, full of determination. He took a step forward, but the man raised his hand, signaling him to stop. Don't make me hurt her, Daniel, the man warned, his tone cold. You want her to leave this room unharmed? Then listen carefully. Emma glanced between the two men, her mind racing. She could see that Daniel was trying to keep control, but it was clear that this man was dangerous. He wasn't going to let them go so easily. What do you want from us? Daniel asked, his voice steady but tinged with anger. What's your plan? The man's smile widened, and he stepped back, finally letting go of Emma's arm. She breathed a sigh of relief, but she didn't dare move. The man was clearly not finished yet. I want everything, Daniel, the man said, his voice suddenly colder. I want your company, your family, your legacy, and I'll have it all, one way or another. Emma's mind spun as she listened to his words. She had no idea who this man was, but she could tell that he was a force to be reckoned with. He had an aura of power, like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Daniel's jaw clenched. You won't get away with this. I'll stop you. The man chuckled softly. You don't have the power to stop me. Not anymore. It's already too late. Emma felt a sudden chill as the man turned his attention to her. And as for you, Emma, he said, his voice sharp and calculating, you're in the way. You're a pawn in a game you don't even understand. But don't worry, you won't be a problem for long. Before Emma could react, the man made a quick motion, and the lights above them flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness. Emma's heart raced, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and she instinctively backed away, her eyes searching for a way out. But as quickly as the darkness had come, it was gone. The lights flickered back on, and Emma found herself staring at the man, who now stood in the corner of the room, a sinister grin on his face. What just happened? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, holding it up for both Daniel and Emma to see. This little device will make sure no one gets in my way, he said, his voice smooth and cold. It will disable the building's security systems, lock down the elevators, and prevent anyone from reaching us. Emma's breath caught in her throat. What do you want with us? She asked, her voice trembling. The man chuckled darkly. What I want is simple. Control. And I'm going to get it. Starting with you two. Daniel's fists clenched, but he didn't speak. Emma could see the tension in his posture, the way he was holding back, waiting for the right moment. The man took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. You see, Daniel, you and your mother never understood just how fragile everything was. The company, your family, it was all just a house of cards. And now I'm going to knock it all down. Daniel's voice was quiet, but filled with a quiet intensity. You don't scare me. The man raised an eyebrow. No. Well, then maybe this will. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the hallway outside the room. The walls trembled, and Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Something was happening, something bigger than they had realized. The building itself seemed to be shaking, and she could hear distant shouts and hurried footsteps. The man turned his attention back to the door, his face growing even darker. It's starting, he muttered. We don't have much time. Daniel's eyes widened. What's happening? What have you done? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the door and motioned for Emma and Daniel to follow. You're coming with me, he said simply. You can either make this easy on yourselves, or I can make it much worse. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She had no idea where he was taking them, but one thing was clear. This man was ruthless. He wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and it seemed like the clock was ticking down faster than they realized. Daniel moved cautiously, but he was clearly trying to think ahead. He wasn't about to let this man control the situation, and Emma could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't going down without a fight. As the three of them moved through the hallway, Emma could feel the atmosphere shifting. The once bustling office building now seemed like a ghost town, dark, empty, and cold. It was as if the world outside had stopped moving, leaving them trapped in this strange, dangerous game. Where are we going? Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. The man didn't answer right away. He led them down a winding staircase, deeper into the building. The further they went, the darker it became. Emma could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the sense that something was closing in on them. Finally, the man stopped in front of a large metal door. He turned to Daniel, his expression unreadable. "This is where it all ends," he said softly. "The choice is yours, Daniel. Give me what I want, or watch everything you've built crumble." Emma's stomach churned as she realized that they had reached the point of no return. This was it, the moment of truth. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "I'm not going to give up without a fight." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then prepare yourself, Daniel. Because this is the moment when everything changes." And as the door swung open, Emma's heart stopped. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, cavernous room that seemed to stretch on forever. A faint red light flickered in the far corner, casting long shadows across the walls. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she glanced around, her mind racing to process everything that had happened so far. The strange man, Daniel's brother, the threats, the building shaking, nothing made sense. Daniel stood in front of her, blocking her view of the room, his face set in a grim expression. "Stay behind me, Emma," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "Whatever happens, don't make a move unless I say so." Emma nodded, her heart racing. She trusted Daniel. He had always been kind to her, even when he had no reason to be. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. She had no idea what was behind that door or what this mysterious man, this brother of Daniel's, was capable of. The tension was so thick she could almost taste it. The man in the hood stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. "Welcome to the end of your world, Daniel," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You had a choice, but now it's too late." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you. Whatever you're planning, it won't work." The man laughed, the sound cold and cruel. "Oh, Daniel, you think you're in control. This isn't about control. This is about fate. And your fate was sealed the moment you chose to stand in my way." With a quick motion, he pushed the door open wider, revealing a large, circular table in the center of the room. At the far end of the table, a woman sat, her back to them. Emma's heart skipped a beat when she recognized her. It was Daniel's mother. She looked older than Emma had remembered, her face lined with age and weariness. But there was something about her that still radiated strength, as though she had weathered storms no one could even imagine. She didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, she didn't seem to acknowledge them at all. She was staring intently at the table, as if lost in thought. "Mother!" Daniel's voice cracked as he took a step toward her. She didn't respond. Emma's pulse quickened as she watched the scene unfold. What was going on? Why was Daniel's mother here? And why didn't she seem to recognize him? The man in the hood, who had remained silent during the exchange, stepped forward and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Your mother," he said with a smirk, "isn't who you think she is." Daniel froze, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" The man's smile grew wider, and he gestured to the woman at the table. "She's been playing both sides all along. She's been using you. She's been using this company. Everything you've worked for, everything your father built. She's been using it all to get what she wants. And now, she's getting exactly what she deserves." Emma's head spun as she tried to process the revelation. Daniel's mother had been playing both sides? She couldn't believe it. The woman who had seemed so kind, so innocent, was she really a mastermind of some hidden agenda? "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What's your game?" The man shrugged. "I'm not telling you because I want you to believe me. I'm telling you because it's the truth. And the truth is, your mother has already made her choice. She's with me now." A chill ran down Emma's spine. Was it possible? Was everything they had known a lie? Daniel stood still, his eyes locked on his mother. He didn't speak for a long moment, as though he were trying to understand what had just been said. The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, his mother turned her head, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were distant, almost as if she didn't recognize him at all. She looked past him and spoke to the man. "Is it done?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a hardness in it that sent a shiver down Emma's spine. The man nodded. "Yes, it's done. Everything is in place." Daniel stepped forward, his hands shaking. "Mother, what have you done? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me about any of this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply stared at him, her face a mask of indifference. For a brief moment, Emma saw a flicker of something: guilt, regret, but it vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. "Daniel, you were never meant to be part of this," she said softly. "This was always bigger than you. You were just a means to an end." Daniel's face turned ashen. "What do you mean? All these years. I've been working for you. I've been building this company, and all along, you've been a pawn in a much larger game," his mother interrupted, her voice cold. "Everything you've worked for, everything you've done, it was all for nothing." Emma felt a lump form in her throat as she watched Daniel's face crumple. This couldn't be real. His mother, the woman who had raised him, who had always been so kind, was now the one who had turned against him. But why? What was she trying to gain? What had happened to change everything so drastically? As Daniel stood there, the weight of his mother's words crashing over him, Emma's mind raced. She didn't know what had happened in this twisted game of power and betrayal, but one thing was clear. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. And it wasn't just Daniel's life on the line anymore. It was hers, too. Before Emma could say anything, the man in the hood turned to her, his gaze cold and calculating. "You're still here? I thought you would have run by now." Emma stood her ground, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "I'm not going anywhere. This doesn't make sense. I want to know the truth." The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if considering her words. "The truth? You want the truth? Fine. The truth is that you're a part of something bigger than you can comprehend. You've been watching from the sidelines, but now you're in the middle of it. And if you think you're going to walk away from this, you're wrong." Emma's heart raced. She couldn't make sense of what was happening, but she knew one thing. The fight was far from over. The forces that controlled this building, that controlled Daniel's family, were powerful and dangerous. But she had made a choice. She wasn't going to run. Not now. Just as the man raised his hand to speak again, there was a loud, explosive sound from outside the room. The walls shook, and the floor beneath them seemed to tremble with the force of something massive happening in the building. "What was that?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with dread. The man smiled a twisted smile, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You're about to find out. The game has only just begun." The sound of the explosion echoed through the building, reverberating off the walls in waves. The floor beneath them seemed to buckle, sending vibrations all through Emma's body. The lights flickered violently before settling into a dim, unsettling glow. Daniel's face paled, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What just happened?" he breathed, his voice tight with panic. The man in the hood, still standing in front of them, looked almost pleased. "Did you really think you could just waltz in here and change everything?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Your mother and I had everything planned. You were never supposed to make it this far." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, a heavy, sickening feeling rising in her stomach. The explosion, the tremors, this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was part of a plan, and they were right in the middle of it. Her mind raced with questions, but she couldn't form a single one before the man spoke again. "It's already too late. The building's systems are down," he continued, his voice low and almost triumphant. "I've activated the security lockdown, and there's no escape. You're all trapped." Daniel took a step back, his hands balling into fists. "You can't do this. You can't control everything," he spat, trying to muster whatever defiance he had left. But Emma could see the fear in his eyes. The man wasn't bluffing. The explosion had been real, and the systems were definitely down. Emma turned to look at Daniel's mother, hoping for any kind of reaction. Some sign that the woman who had given birth to Daniel, the woman he had always trusted, would step in and stop this madness. But there was no sign of compassion, no hint of remorse. The woman sat motionless at the table, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed forward as if she were watching something far beyond the room, her silence deafening. "Mother," Daniel called out, his voice desperate. "Please tell me this isn't true. You can't be a part of this. You can't be with him." His mother's head tilted slightly, but she didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze seemed to pierce through him, as if she were seeing something far beyond his presence. Finally, her lips parted, but the words that left her mouth chilled Emma to the bone. "Daniel, it was always meant to be this way. I had to make this choice. The company needed a new leader, and I wasn't the one for it anymore. But you were always just a means to an end." Daniel's entire body seemed to collapse in on itself, his face filled with pain and disbelief. "What are you talking about? All these years. I thought I was helping you. I thought I was building something for us, for our future." The woman sighed softly, her voice devoid of any warmth. "There was no future, Daniel. Not for us. Your father made a lot of mistakes. And now the company is mine, mine to do with as I please. And as for you, you were always expendable. Emma felt a coldness seep into her bones. The betrayal was unlike anything she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a family divided. It was a family that had orchestrated its own destruction. And Daniel was right at the center of it all, left in the ruins, unable to even grasp the full extent of what had been done to him. "Stop," Emma shouted, her voice shaky but fierce. "This isn't right. You can't do this to him, to all of us. There's always another way." The man in the hood turned his cold eyes toward her. "You really think you have a say in this, Emma? This is beyond your understanding. You've been a part of this game whether you like it or not. You're too deep now." Emma shook her head. "I don't understand. I've just been trying to help, trying to be kind. How does any of this make sense?" The man smirked. "The truth never makes sense to people like you, does it? You think that if you just do the right thing, everything will work out. But life doesn't work that way. It's a game, and everyone has a part to play." Just then, a loud siren blared, filling the room with a deafening noise. The lights flickered again, this time flashing sporadically, casting eerie shadows that seemed to grow larger with every passing second. "What's happening now?" Daniel demanded, his eyes wide as he looked around in alarm. "It's starting," the man in the hood replied calmly, as if everything unfolding was exactly according to plan. "The building's going to collapse. The walls will cave in. This whole structure is coming down, and when it does, I'll have everything I need." The realization hit Emma like a slap to the face. "You're going to destroy everything? The whole building? Why?" "Because," the man said with a sneer, "it's the only way to end this. To wipe away the past and start over. Everything in this building, everything your father worked for, was built on lies. It's time to erase it all." Emma's mind spun, struggling to process the horrifying truth. The man wasn't just after power, he was after complete destruction. He wanted to tear down the company, tear down everything Daniel's family had built, and make sure there was nothing left standing. Daniel gritted his teeth, his anger surging. "You won't get away with this. I'll stop you." "You think you can stop me, Daniel?" the man said, laughing darkly. "You and your mother are nothing but pawns. You never had the power you thought you had." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized what was at stake. If the building collapsed, everything would be destroyed. Daniel's legacy, his future, his chance to reclaim what was taken from him. She couldn't just stand by and let that happen. "Daniel," she said urgently, her voice trembling, "we have to stop him. We can't let him destroy everything." He turned to her, his face conflicted, torn between the weight of his mother's betrayal and the need to protect everything he had worked for. But there was something else in his eyes, something that Emma had seen in his actions all along. A glimmer of hope, even in the darkest of moments. "I won't give up," Daniel said firmly, his voice steady. "I'll fight for what's mine." As the man in the hood moved closer, his smile wide with wicked anticipation, Emma realized that this wasn't just a battle for a company. It was a battle for their lives. The building was collapsing around them, but they still had a chance to stop this madness, to change the outcome. But it would take everything they had. Every ounce of courage. Every scrap of hope. And just as the man reached for the control panel to activate the final stage of the destruction, Daniel made his move. The moment Daniel made his move, Emma felt the rush of adrenaline fill the room. Without thinking, he lunged at the man in the hood, knocking him off balance. The man stumbled back, his face contorted with rage, but Daniel didn't stop. He pushed forward, grabbing the man by his collar and slamming him into the cold, concrete wall of the room. "You won't get away with this," Daniel shouted, his voice raw with fury. The man struggled, trying to break free, but Daniel's grip tightened. For a moment, it seemed like Daniel had finally taken control of the situation. But then, with a swift motion, the man pulled out a hidden knife, slashing it across Daniel's arm. "Ah!" Daniel yelled, his grip loosening for just a second as he recoiled from the pain. The man twisted out of his hold, his eyes burning with malice. Emma's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. She couldn't just stand there. She had to do something. She couldn't let Daniel lose now, not after everything they had been through. Thinking quickly, Emma grabbed a nearby metal chair, the legs screeching across the floor as she swung it at the man. The chair crashed into his side, sending him stumbling back. The man snarled, his rage escalating, but it gave Daniel enough time to recover. "Daniel, now!" Emma shouted, urging him to act quickly. With a burst of energy, Daniel rushed toward the control panel on the wall, his eyes wild with desperation. He slammed his fist into the button, and the alarm silenced. The countdown to the building's destruction stopped. But just as Emma thought they had won, the man in the hood let out a sickening laugh. "You think it's over?" he sneered. "This building isn't the only thing that's going to fall." The lights above them flickered once more, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward Daniel. His mother, she was still sitting motionless at the table, her gaze fixed on them, distant and cold. She hadn't moved an inch since the fight had started. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, Daniel's mother slowly stood up, her movements deliberate and calm. Her eyes were locked onto her son's as she took a step toward him. "You don't understand, Daniel," she said softly, her voice as cold as ice. "It was never about the company. It was never about control. It's about survival." Daniel looked at her, confusion and disbelief written on his face. "What are you talking about?" His mother's lips twisted into a faint, bitter smile. "You've always been so naive, Daniel. You've been blind to everything. To the truth about this family, about this company. And you've been blind to the real enemy." Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "What enemy? What do you mean?" The woman looked at Emma, her gaze sharp and calculating. "You, Emma. You're part of it too. You've been unknowingly woven into the fabric of all this. You think you're helping him, but you're only making it worse." Emma recoiled, her heart skipping a beat. "What are you talking about? How am I involved?" Daniel's mother didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the far end of the room, where a large, ancient-looking map was pinned to the wall. Emma couldn't make out the details, but she could see markings red, blue, black, across the map, connected by lines. It was a complex web, something far beyond her understanding. "Do you see this?" she asked, gesturing to the map. "This is the network. The real power. The ones who pull the strings. They've been watching us all along. Watching our family. Watching you, Emma." Emma felt a chill run through her. "The network?" she whispered. "What are you talking about?" Her mother turned, her face hardening. "It's not just a company. It's a front for something much bigger. Your father knew it. I knew it. And now you're both part of it too." The walls seemed to close in on Emma as she tried to absorb her words. It felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, everything she thought she knew crumbling into dust. She wasn't just caught up in a family's betrayal. She was caught in the middle of something vast, something dangerous. And she had no idea how deep the roots of this network ran. Daniel stood motionless, his face pale and shaken. "You've been a part of this from the beginning, haven't you? You knew. And you let me walk right into it." His mother's eyes softened for just a moment, a flicker of regret in them. "I didn't want this for you, Daniel. But the choices have already been made. There's no going back now." The room seemed to darken even further, as though the very air itself was thickening with the weight of these revelations. Emma's mind spun, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. She had been dragged into this mess without even knowing it, and now the truth was more twisted than she could have imagined. "You've been playing us all along," Daniel said, his voice breaking as the realization hit him. "Everything I've done, everything I've worked for, was all for nothing. And you." Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed from the door. A group of armed men stormed into the room, their guns raised, their expressions cold and determined. They were dressed in black, their faces hidden behind masks. "Everything you've worked for is about to be destroyed," one of them said, his voice muffled by the mask. Daniel's mother didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her gaze unyielding. "Take them. We're finished here." Emma's stomach twisted in horror. She was trapped. They both were. There was no escape. The armed men approached them, but Daniel stepped in front of Emma, protecting her with his own body. "No, we won't go down without a fight." But the man who had first spoken to them smirked. "You don't have a choice." Emma felt a chill run down her spine as they were surrounded. The realization hit her. They were outnumbered, outmatched. There was no way out. But just as the armed men closed in, the building shook again, this time more violently. The walls cracked, and dust began to fall from the ceiling. "What's happening now?" Daniel demanded, his voice desperate as he looked around. "This can't be good." The man in black seemed unaffected, a dark satisfaction in his eyes. "It's over. You don't know it yet, but you've already lost." As the building shook again, Emma realized something. They weren't just fighting for control of a company anymore. This was something far worse. This was a battle for survival itself. And as the world seemed to collapse around them, One question remained in her mind. Would they make it out alive? The tremors in the building grew stronger with each passing second. The walls groaned under the pressure, and the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Emma felt her heart hammering in her chest as the armed men closed in on them. But it wasn't just the men she was afraid of. It was the building itself. It felt like the very foundation of everything around them was cracking and breaking, the walls threatening to swallow them whole. Daniel's grip on her tightened as he stepped protectively in front of her. "We're not going to let you take us," he said, his voice fierce, though the fear was unmistakable in his eyes. He didn't know what was coming next, and neither did Emma, but they both knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The man in black who had spoken before seemed calm, almost too calm. He looked at Daniel with a twisted smirk on his face. "You don't have a choice. You're already too late. The building's collapse was part of the plan. And so are you." Emma's mind raced. The explosion, the lockdown, the tremors, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a takeover of the company. It was a coordinated effort to destroy everything. It wasn't just about power. It was about control over something far greater than they had realized. The company was just a tool in a much darker scheme. Daniel's mother, still standing near the table, remained silent, her face expressionless as her son stood defiant before the men. But as Emma glanced at her, something shifted in her gaze. For a split second, Emma could see something in her eyes. Fear, perhaps? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same cold indifference that had been there from the beginning. The armed men moved closer, their guns raised. "This is your last chance," the man in black said, his voice calm and almost soothing. "Cooperate, and we'll make it quick. Resist, and things will get messy." Daniel stood tall, his chin lifted in defiance. He was breathing heavily, his body tense, but his resolve was clear. "I will never cooperate with you. You're nothing but criminals." The man in black's eyes hardened, and he nodded to the others. They stepped forward, surrounding Daniel and Emma. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she thought that this was it, that all hope had been lost. But then, the building trembled once more, this time with a force that made the walls crack and groan. The lights flickered one last time and then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Emma gasped, her hand instinctively reaching out to grab hold of Daniel's arm. The air was thick with dust, and she could barely see a thing. "Now's our chance." Daniel's voice came from the darkness, clear and steady, as if he had prepared for this moment. He didn't wait for Emma to respond. Instead, he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the nearest exit, the one leading into a narrow hallway that they had passed on their way in. "Stay close to me," he whispered urgently, "and don't stop running." Emma didn't hesitate. She followed him as he navigated through the pitch-black hallway, every step seeming to send a shiver through the air. She could hear the heavy footsteps of the armed men following them, but they didn't seem to be able to catch up as quickly. The building was falling apart around them, and the ground seemed to shake under their feet. As they turned a corner, Emma heard the distant sound of gunfire. The armed men had fired a few shots, but it didn't seem to faze them. They kept running, pushing forward, adrenaline pumping through their veins. "This way!" Daniel shouted as he yanked open a door, pulling Emma into what appeared to be an old storage room. The room was filled with boxes, old furniture, and dusty equipment, but it was hidden away from the chaos unfolding in the halls. It was their only chance to regroup. They barely had time to catch their breath before the door behind them slammed open. The armed men entered, their eyes scanning the room. Emma and Daniel ducked behind a stack of crates, their hearts racing. "Where are they?" one of the men growled, his voice low. They couldn't have gotten far. Emma held her breath, praying they wouldn't be discovered. She could hear the men moving closer, their boots scraping against the floor. For a moment, everything seemed still, as though time had stopped. Then, without warning, Daniel grabbed Emma's arm again. "We need to get to the lower levels," he whispered urgently. "That's where the emergency exits are. We can get out of here if we're fast enough." Emma didn't argue. She trusted him completely. They had no time to waste. Together, they slipped out of the room, moving quietly through the darkness. The walls around them seemed to groan and crack as the building continued to shake. Every step they took felt like it could be their last, but they kept moving, determined to survive. They finally reached a set of stairs leading down to the lower levels, where Emma knew the emergency exits were located. The stairwell was eerily silent, and Emma could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her. "We're almost there," Daniel whispered as they descended, his voice steady but strained. "Once we're out of the building, we'll be safe. But we need to hurry." As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the emergency exit doors loomed ahead of them. But just as they approached, the sound of more footsteps echoed in the distance. They weren't alone. "We don't have time," Emma said, panic creeping into her voice. "They're closing in on us." Daniel turned to face her, his eyes fierce. "We're not going to let them win. We'll make it out." But just as he reached for the door handle, the building shook violently once more. This time, the walls cracked open, and dust and debris began to fall from the ceiling. The door wouldn't open. They were trapped. "Come on," Daniel shouted, pulling at the door. But it was no use. The building was coming apart, and they had no way out. Emma's heart sank as the walls seemed to close in on them. They were running out of time, and the chances of escape were slipping away. Just as she thought all hope was lost, she heard a loud crash from above. A section of the ceiling fell away, revealing a small ventilation shaft high up in the wall. It was their only chance. "Up there," Emma shouted, pointing toward the opening. "We can climb through." Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward the shaft. The walls shook violently as they scrambled to climb, the dust choking their breath, but they didn't stop. There was no time to waste. The building was falling down around them. But they weren't giving up, not yet. The ventilation shaft was narrow, cramped, and filled with dust. Emma could barely see anything as she crawled behind Daniel, each movement more difficult than the last. The air was thick and suffocating, and her lungs burned with each breath she took. Still, she pushed forward, determined to escape the collapsing building. Behind her, she could hear Daniel's strained breathing, the occasional scrape of his clothing against the narrow metal walls. He was leading the way, his body moving with a purpose, his mind focused entirely on getting them out. But Emma knew that time was running out. The building had already begun to fall apart. Every minute they spent in this shaft was another minute closer to disaster. "Almost there," Daniel said breathlessly. "Just a little further." Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure she could keep going. She could feel the vibrations from the building's collapse shuddering through the walls of the shaft, and the sound of things crumbling above them sent chills down her spine. The tremors were so intense now that she wondered how much longer the entire structure would hold up. "Keep going," Daniel urged again, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Emma clenched her teeth and crawled forward, ignoring the ache in her arms and legs. She had to keep going. She had no choice. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the end of the shaft. There was a small grate at the top, just large enough for them to squeeze through. Daniel reached up first, prying it open with a few forceful pushes. He pulled himself through, his arms straining with effort, and then he reached down to help Emma. "Come on," he said, his hand extended. "We're almost there." Emma grabbed his hand, and with his help, she pulled herself out of the shaft. They both collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The room they had landed in was dimly lit, but it was clear that it was some sort of maintenance area. There were large, heavy pipes running along the walls, and the smell of rust and oil filled the air. Daniel didn't waste any time. He quickly stood up and grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her toward the door at the far side of the room. She followed him without question, her legs shaky from exhaustion, but her mind racing. "There should be an emergency exit around here," Daniel said, his voice determined. "We can't waste any more time." They reached the door, but just as Daniel was about to open it, a loud crash from behind them made both of them freeze. Emma turned to see the ceiling beginning to cave in, the dust and debris falling from the weakened structure. The building was coming down faster than they had expected. "Move," Daniel shouted, and before Emma could react, he yanked the door open and pushed her through. They ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the silence. But as they turned the corner, they were met with a sight that made Emma's blood run cold. A group of armed men stood at the end of the hallway, blocking their path. The man in black, the one who had been leading the assault, was standing in front, his arms crossed, his expression smug. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice mocking. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks, his body tensing. "We're not going to let you stop us," he said, his voice low but filled with defiance. The man in black shook his head slowly. "You really think you can escape? The building's already on its way down. You're not getting out of here alive." Emma's heart hammered in her chest. There was no way around them. The building was falling apart, and the exit they had been so close to was now blocked. "You're wasting your time," the man continued, taking a slow step toward them. "You should have stayed in your place." You were never meant to win. Daniel didn't flinch. He was still standing tall, his fists clenched. You're wrong, he said. We're not your pawns. This ends now. Without another word, he charged forward, pushing past the first armed man. Emma's heart raced as she watched Daniel fight back, his moves swift and calculated. The men in black tried to subdue him, but Daniel was faster, stronger than they expected. Emma didn't wait to see the outcome. She knew they couldn't afford to lose any more time. The building was still collapsing, and they needed to move. She sprinted ahead, trying to find another way out. As she rounded another corner, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, and when she looked back, she saw one of the armed men closing in on her. "Get away from me," she screamed, her voice full of panic. She turned and ran faster, her legs burning with exhaustion, but the man was right behind her. He was gaining on her. Emma's breath was ragged, and her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when freedom was so close. As she turned another corner, she finally saw it, the emergency exit, just ahead, the light from the outside world beckoning her toward safety. She could hear the distant sound of sirens and helicopters, but she didn't care. She just had to get out. With one final burst of energy, Emma reached the exit door and yanked it open. The night air hit her like a wave, cool and fresh after the stifling heat of the building. She stepped out into the street, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. But her relief was short-lived. The man in black was still pursuing her. She could hear his footsteps growing louder, and she knew that if he caught her, it would all be over. Just as he was about to grab her, a sudden flash of light blinded them both. A helicopter hovered overhead, its spotlight sweeping over the area. Emma's heart skipped a beat when she saw the familiar figure of Daniel standing behind the man in black, his body tense and ready for whatever came next. The helicopter dropped a rope ladder, and Daniel grabbed hold of it, pulling himself up. Emma didn't hesitate. She ran toward the helicopter, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her, and grabbed onto the ladder. The man in black reached out, his hand almost touching her ankle, but he was too late. The helicopter began to rise, pulling Emma and Daniel to safety as the man in black shouted in frustration below. As they soared higher and higher, leaving the crumbling building behind, Emma couldn't help but look back at the chaos below. The building, once towering and proud, was now a pile of rubble. The fight was over, but the cost had been great. Everything they had worked for, everything they had believed in, had been destroyed. But they had survived. As the helicopter climbed higher, Emma turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "We did it. We're free." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the burning wreckage below, his face expressionless. After a long moment, he turned to her, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "We've survived. But the fight isn't over yet." The helicopter soared through the night sky, leaving the crumbling remains of the building behind them. Emma sat quietly beside Daniel, her hands gripping the ladder tightly as they climbed higher into the air. The wind whipped around them, but all she could think about was the destruction they had just escaped. The man in black, the armed men, and Daniel's mother. It was all too much to process. She glanced at Daniel, who was staring at the burning wreckage below. He hadn't said a word since they had lifted off. "Daniel," Emma whispered, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" Daniel's gaze flickered toward her, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. His eyes were haunted, distant. He was still processing everything that had happened, the betrayal, the destruction of his family's company, the truth about his mother's involvement. Emma could see the weight of it all pressing down on him. "I don't know," Daniel said softly, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Everything I believed in, everything I worked for, it's all gone. And the worst part is that I never saw it coming." Emma reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. "You fought for what was right. That's what matters. You didn't give up. You didn't let them win." He glanced at her, and for the first time, a faint hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I guess so, but it doesn't feel like enough." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the helicopter's engine the only sound between them. Below, the city of Nakuru spread out like a sea of lights, but it all felt so distant now, like a world they had left behind. As they flew further away from the chaos, Emma realized that their fight wasn't over. The building was gone, but the people behind this destruction were still out there, and Daniel's mother was still a part of it all. The man in black, the armed men, she had no doubt that they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And if they were going to survive, they needed to understand just what they were up against. "Where are we going?" Emma asked, her voice breaking the silence. Daniel turned to look at her, his face grim. "We need to get somewhere safe. I don't know who we can trust anymore, but we can't stay in Nakuru. There are too many people who want to see us dead." The helicopter swerved slightly as the pilot adjusted their course, and Emma felt a cold knot form in her stomach. What had Daniel's mother meant when she said everything was a game? What had she meant by the network? There were so many unanswered questions, and now, with everything they had just learned, Emma was beginning to realize that they were only scratching the surface. "Where will we go?" Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How do we even begin to figure out what to do next?" Daniel looked out at the horizon, his jaw set. "There's only one place we can go. Somewhere I can get answers. My father's old contacts. If anyone knows what's really going on, it's them." Emma nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure where that would lead them. What kind of answers would they find? Would they be able to stop the people who had nearly destroyed everything? And what about Daniel's mother? She had been at the heart of all of this. Was she truly a villain, or was there more to her story than Daniel had realized? The helicopter continued its flight, the city fading into the distance behind them. It was then that Emma noticed something odd in the sky ahead. The helicopter's lights reflected off a cluster of other aircraft. There were several, all moving in the same direction, their bright lights blinking in unison. "What's that?" Emma asked, pointing toward the lights. Daniel's face darkened. "That's not a good sign. We're being followed." Emma's heart dropped. "What? How could they have found us so quickly?" "They must have tracked us somehow," Daniel muttered. "We can't keep flying like this. They'll catch up to us." Without warning, Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing the radio. He spoke quickly to the pilot, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Turn to the west. Take us to the mountains." The pilot responded quickly, making a sharp turn as they veered off their course. The other helicopters followed, maintaining a steady pursuit. Emma's mind raced. Who were these people? Were they connected to the man in black? To Daniel's mother? "Are we going to make it?" Emma asked, her voice tight with fear. Daniel's expression was unreadable. "We have to. If they catch us, it's over. We don't have a choice." The helicopters were getting closer now, the roar of their engines growing louder. Emma's breath quickened as she glanced at the rapidly approaching fleet. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her thoughts scattered as she tried to make sense of everything that was happening. Suddenly, the radio crackled again, and the pilot spoke in a rushed voice. "Sir, we have incoming missiles. They're locking onto us." Emma's blood ran cold. Missiles? Were they really going to try to shoot them down? Daniel's eyes flashed with determination. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Get us out of here," he shouted to the pilot. The helicopter swerved violently as the pilot made sharp turns to avoid the incoming missiles. Emma gripped the ladder tightly, her body thrown against the side of the helicopter with each twist. The world outside was a blur as they sped through the night sky, dodging missiles, the other helicopters still in hot pursuit. "Hold on," Daniel shouted, his voice rising with urgency. "We need to get to the mountain range. We can lose them there." The sound of another missile being launched cut through the chaos, followed by the terrifying shriek of it slicing through the air. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the worst, but the missile missed, exploding harmlessly in the distance. The pilot veered sharply again, and Emma could hear the rattling of the helicopter's frame as it struggled to maintain its course. "Come on," Daniel muttered to himself, his jaw clenched. "We can't let them get us." The mountain range loomed ahead, its jagged peaks cutting through the night sky. They were almost there, but Emma could still hear the faint hum of the helicopters behind them, getting closer and closer. The chase wasn't over yet. They had one chance to escape, and everything depended on how quickly the pilot could maneuver them into the mountains. As the mountain peaks grew closer, Emma's mind raced. They had survived the building's collapse. They had fought their way through everything up to this point. But now, with missiles flying at them and the fate of their lives hanging in the balance, Emma couldn't help but wonder. Could they outrun this new enemy? Would they ever truly be free? The mountain range loomed ahead like an impenetrable wall of jagged peaks, their snow-capped tops glowing under the moonlight. The helicopters were gaining on them, their engines roaring like predators closing in on their prey. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest, every beat of it echoing in her ears as the helicopter raced toward the safety of the mountains. The other helicopters followed closely, their bright searchlights sweeping over the terrain, scanning for any sign of their target. "We're not going to outrun them like this," Daniel muttered, his face grim as he gripped the seat, his eyes fixed on the mountains ahead. "Then we fight back," Emma said, her voice sharp with determination. "We have to do something." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to the cockpit, where the pilot was maneuvering them between the peaks, weaving through the narrow gaps in the mountainside. Every twist and turn made Emma's stomach lurch, but there was no time to waste. They had to find a way to stop the pursuit before they were caught. "I'm not going down without a fight," Daniel finally said, his voice low and filled with resolve. "But we need a plan." Emma's mind raced, her thoughts racing through every possibility. She knew the enemy was relentless, but there had to be a way to stop them. She turned to look at the back of the helicopter, scanning the compartments filled with equipment. A small, cruel thought crossed her mind. They were carrying weapons. If they could get their hands on something, maybe they could use it to fight back. "Do you have any weapons?" Emma asked, her eyes flicking to the bags of gear strapped to the sides of the helicopter. Daniel's gaze followed hers, and he nodded. "There's an arsenal back there, but we need to get to it fast. If they catch up to us, it'll be too late." With no time to waste, Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt and moved toward the back of the helicopter, his movements quick and purposeful. Emma followed him, the tension thick in the air as they both reached the supply area. There were crates of ammo, rifles, and even grenade launchers stashed in the compartments. Emma's hand hovered over a few of the weapons before she grabbed a small, compact rifle. "Got it," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was still pounding. "What's the plan?" Daniel grabbed a rifle as well, checking its ammunition before handing it to Emma. "We use what we have to take out the helicopters. If we can disable their engines, they won't be able to follow us." Emma nodded, though she had no idea how they were going to pull that off. They were just two people in a helicopter, armed only with a couple of rifles, and their pursuers had far more resources. Still, there was no other choice. This was the only chance they had. "We need to get a clean shot at their engines," Daniel said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "If we hit one of their propellers, they'll have no choice but to pull back. But we need to be accurate." Emma took a deep breath and nodded, her grip tightening on the rifle. She wasn't sure if she could pull it off, but she was going to try. The helicopter lurched again as the pilot made another sharp turn, narrowly avoiding a missile that zipped past them. Emma's heart skipped a beat, and she steadied herself. "We need to move now," Daniel urged, grabbing the controls of one of the rifles. "We can't wait for them to get any closer." The roar of the enemy helicopters filled the air, and Emma could feel their presence, the feeling of danger creeping up her spine. She turned back to the open door, her rifle trained on the pursuing helicopters, and waited for the perfect moment. "Now!" Daniel shouted, his voice a sharp command. Emma aimed her rifle at the closest helicopter, the one in the lead, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the sound deafening in the air. Her heart skipped as the bullet flew straight toward the engine of the helicopter, hitting its mark. The engine sputtered, sparks flying from the machine, and the helicopter veered off course, smoke trailing behind it as it spiraled downward. "Yes!" Emma shouted, her voice filled with exhilaration. But their victory was short-lived. The remaining helicopters didn't retreat, they only grew more aggressive. The other helicopters quickly adjusted, swooping in even closer, determined to finish what they had started. The pilot of the helicopter they were in swerved again, trying to avoid another incoming missile, but the enemy helicopters were relentless. "They're not giving up," Daniel muttered, his voice tense. "They're going to try again." Emma quickly reloaded her rifle, scanning for another target. She could see the helicopter that had taken damage, struggling to stay in the air. It wasn't going to last much longer. But there were still two more helicopters closing in. The odds were against them. "We need to take out the others," Emma said, her voice steady despite the panic that gnawed at her. "We can't keep running forever." Daniel nodded, his eyes narrowing as he aimed his rifle. They had one shot at this. They had to make it count. Just as the helicopters closed in, Emma saw an opportunity. The one on the far right was starting to slow, trying to get in position for another missile strike. She aimed carefully, watching the helicopter's movements, and fired. The shot rang out, and this time, the engine sputtered and caught fire, sending the helicopter plummeting toward the ground. "Yes," Daniel shouted. "That's two down." But there was still one more, and it was coming fast. The remaining helicopter closed the gap between them with terrifying speed, and Emma could feel her heart racing. The missile was incoming, the lock-on alert flashing red in her mind. She had only a split second to react. "Hang on," the pilot shouted from the front. Without thinking, Emma pulled the trigger, aiming for the last helicopter's engine. The bullet hit its mark, and the helicopter wavered in the air. It was enough to cause a slight malfunction, but not enough to bring it down. The missile launched just seconds later, and Emma's eyes widened as the missile streaked toward them. "Brace for impact," Daniel shouted. Time seemed to slow as the missile approached, the moment hanging in the air like a nightmare. But then, the missile exploded in a violent burst, far from their helicopter. The pilot had done a sharp evasive maneuver, avoiding the missile by mere inches. The final helicopter was now damaged and trailing behind them. Emma felt a rush of relief. They had done it. For now, they had survived. Daniel let out a long breath and relaxed for the first time since the chase began. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, though the edge of panic in his voice had finally faded. "But we're still alive." Emma looked out the door of the helicopter, watching as the remaining enemy helicopter struggled to stay in the air, its engines sputtering. It began to veer off in the opposite direction, smoke trailing behind it. They had won for now. The helicopter flew on, the mountains ahead offering some semblance of safety, but Emma knew that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There were still questions to be answered, and the people they were up against weren't going to give up so easily. But for the first time in a long while, Emma felt something she hadn't in ages: hope. The helicopter finally began to level out, the intense shaking of the last few minutes slowly subsiding. Emma's heart was still racing, and the adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel lightheaded. She glanced over at Daniel, who was staring out of the window, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were focused, determined. The mountain range stretched out beneath them, a sea of snow-capped peaks under the pale moonlight. The lights of the city, once a familiar sight, were now a distant memory. They were heading into the wilderness, away from everything they had known. Emma leaned back in her seat, trying to catch her breath, but every moment felt like a weight pressing down on her. There was still so much to figure out. The enemy, the man in black, Daniel's mother, the network. She didn't know who they could trust or how they could even begin to fight against this powerful, faceless enemy. "How much further?" Emma asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Not much," Daniel replied, his voice hoarse. "We should be near a safe house. My father's old contact, Maceo, will be there. He was one of the few people my father trusted. If anyone has answers, it's him." Emma nodded, trying to steady her thoughts. They needed answers, desperately. They had escaped the helicopters, but she knew that wasn't the end of it. The network was vast, and if Daniel's mother was at the heart of it, they were facing an enemy unlike anything they'd ever imagined. The helicopter banked sharply, cutting through the night air as the pilot adjusted their course. The mountains seemed to close in on them, towering and imposing, but Emma felt a sense of relief. They were headed somewhere safer, for now. As they neared the mountain valley, Emma noticed a small cabin nestled against the base of one of the peaks. It was dark, the lights inside dim, but it was still standing, a place of shelter in a world that had turned upside down. The helicopter began its descent, and Emma braced herself, ready for whatever was next. The helicopter touched down softly in a clearing near the cabin, the rotors slowly winding down as the air grew still. Emma's hands were still trembling, but she knew that there was no time to rest. They had to act quickly, find Maceo, and figure out what to do next. The door of the helicopter opened, and Daniel stood up first, followed by Emma. The cold night air hit them immediately, a biting chill that made her shiver. She wrapped her arms around herself for warmth as she stepped onto the ground, her eyes scanning the area. The cabin was small, tucked away in the valley, and seemingly untouched by the chaos outside. It felt like a sanctuary, something that had been left behind in a world that had moved on. But Emma knew it was just a brief respite. There was no true safety in this world anymore. Not with the people chasing them. "Stay close," Daniel said softly, leading the way toward the cabin. "Maceo's inside." They approached the cabin, and Daniel knocked twice on the wooden door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. There was a long pause before a voice from inside called out. "Who is it?" "Daniel," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "It's me." The door creaked open, and a tall man with graying hair and a rough, weathered face appeared in the doorway. His eyes narrowed as they met Daniel's, but there was a flicker of recognition. "Daniel," Maceo said, stepping aside to allow them entry. "It's been a long time." Daniel didn't waste any time. He walked inside without hesitation, Emma following close behind. The cabin was simple, but it had a warmth to it, a comfort that Emma hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow over the room. There were shelves lined with books, maps, and old equipment, signs of a life lived off the grid. "We're in trouble, Maceo," Daniel said, his voice low but urgent. "We need your help." Maceo nodded, his face serious as he gestured to a chair by the fire. "Sit down. Tell me what's going on." Daniel and Emma both took seats, and Daniel quickly filled Maceo in on everything that had happened. The explosion, the pursuit, his mother's betrayal, the network, the story poured out of him in a rush, his words tinged with disbelief and anger. As he spoke, Emma watched Maceo's face carefully. He didn't interrupt, but she could see the wheels turning in his mind. When Daniel finished, Maceo leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "So your mother is involved in all of this," he said quietly. "That's something I didn't expect. Your father was always careful about who he trusted. But this is much bigger than you realize, Daniel. This is bigger than your mother." Emma's stomach twisted with unease. "What do you mean? What's really going on?" Maceo stood and began pacing slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your family has been part of something much larger than the company you knew. It's not just about power or control, not even just about money. It's about influence, global influence. Your father was part of a network, a group of individuals with a hand in nearly every major event in the world. Governments, corporations, even private institutions. They've been working behind the scenes, pulling the strings, creating the world we know today." Emma's mind reeled as she absorbed his words. She had no idea how deep the web stretched, how many people were involved in this network. "But what does all this mean for us?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with desperation. "If they've been controlling everything, what chance do we have?" Maceo stopped pacing and looked at Daniel directly. "It means that you and your mother are just the tip of the iceberg. There are people out there, powerful people, who want to control everything, and they'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. This fight isn't just about your company. It's about the future. Your family has been involved for years, and now it's your turn to decide what kind of world you want to live in." Emma looked at Daniel, seeing the conflict in his eyes. The weight of his family's legacy was now his burden to bear. He had been thrown into a battle that was much larger than he could have imagined, and she had been pulled into it with him. "We can't let them win," Daniel said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. "We won't let them." Maceo nodded slowly. "I didn't expect this to happen so soon. But now that you're here, we need to act quickly. They'll come after you. Your mother's allies will stop at nothing to make sure you're silenced. We need to figure out who we can trust, and we need to find a way to stop them. Once and for all." Daniel stood, a fierce determination settling over him. "Then let's get to work. It's time to end this." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something much bigger. The fate of the world, the future of everything they knew, was in their hands. And with that, the next chapter of their fight began.